tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. When the Buddha describes right view, the first limb of the Eightfold Path, or when it gets described in the Pali Canon, it gets described in quite a number of ways. There's a bunch of different definitions, including, viewing or seeing experience through the light of the Four Noble Truths. So doing a kind of vipassana practice. This would be fourth foundation of mindfulness practice, of seeing or experiencing, really getting the felt sense, understanding suffering as it arises, really understanding and seeing how craving or clinging gives rise to suffering, doing the work of uprooting that craving, seeing or really understanding cessation from suffering, and really understanding and cultivating the path to cessation, so the Four Noble Truths. In other places, right view or wise view is described through the links of dependent origination. So really understanding how suffering comes to be based on perception, based on reactivity to pleasant and unpleasant stimulus, and then on into grasping, clinging, and becoming, taking on fixated identities of different kinds. In all of the forms of right view, there's a pointing to the lens through which we see the world or understand the world. And that's why it's the word view. In Pali, the word is ditti, to see, seeing, view. The parallel Sanskrit word is drishti. And so the way that we see the world is our view. And view in Pali and Sanskrit has the same double meaning as the word has in English. So view is how I physically see objects in front of me, the room, the objects, the screen, you. But it's also how I understand. So view means not just how I physically see, but how I philosophically or cognitively process the world. And view touches into what we could call worldview or deep belief systems. So if you have the feeling or the model that people are basically good, right? That's an answer to an ancient question about evil. Why is there evil in the world? And you might say people are fundamentally good, but they lose their way. That's a view. It's a view. You might say, the world is a battleground between good and evil, and will, always be, there will always be this dyad of forces, pulling people one way or the other. And at the end of time, there's a great battle where the forces of heaven and the forces of hell battle on earth for the souls of people. That's a view, And views in the Dharma, there's a couple interesting things that are said about view. There's clearly views that are called right rather than wrong. And often we gloss the word right by saying right as in upright, like a ship that is righted. But there is wrong view, miccha ditti, all right, seeing in a way that is not upright. And so let's not be too squeamish about the duality of right and wrong here. This is not a non-dual teaching, actually, yet. Ultimately, yes, but in practicality, no. There is right and wrong view. How do we understand right and wrong view? Right and wrong view, in all of the models given in the texts, is really about a view that is skillful in terms of leading to the goal being cessation of suffering, right? Awakening, arahantship, liberation. Because in many places, the Buddha will also say, hold no fixed views. Some of the very early texts that we know of in the Sutta Nipata and in the Atthakavagga, these are parts of the Pali Canon that are very ancient, scholars think now. Some parts of those texts really emphasize a core practice of being unattached to any view at all. Right? So any idea or belief system that we use to order the world is going to be pragmatic at certain times and not useful at others. And that's true for all views, including helpful ones like the Dharma. So the ultimate or non-dual liberation comes when all views finally are dropped, including the view of the Dhamma. But leading up to that moment, it's impossible, in fact, to get to that moment unless we hold tight to seeing the world accurately. This is partly why Buddhism gets called sometimes a science rather than a religion, because there's this underlying investigative push to see the world accurately. And we see it through direct experience rather than, external experiment. But there's still this way where what we're encouraged to do is look at the world through a certain lens, the way a scientist might through a telescope or a microscope or a camera lens or something, or through the lens of a theory, and then compare what is observed to the theory, right? So I might be a biologist and have a theory that, this is the life cycle of a plant. And maybe all plants of a certain kind follow a similar life cycle. But in order to really test that, I have to observe a lot of plants. And some of them will follow that life cycle and some of them won't. And the ones that don't, I have to figure out where they fit in the model. I say, oh, it's not a plant, it's a fungus. It behaves differently. And so I have a theory, that's the view, and then I observe reality using whatever tools I have, the best technology I have available. And if I'm skillful in my observation, I get a better theory. In science, it's always only a better theory. It's never the absolute truth, because you could always get a better, piece of equipment and observe more closely, and the theory will shift. Newtonian physics worked really well for a while until the telescopes got so good they could see things happening in outer space, or the microscopes got so fine they could see things happening in microscopic space that suddenly didn't make sense with the Newtonian model, and they had to add a new model. So you have a view, you test it through observation, and then you continually refine that view so that it's a helpful lens with which to understand the world. I think a skillful scientist or explorer of the world, whether inner or outer, always holds the view that any theory is provisional and can be unproved at any moment if more data comes in. And I think any real scientist, if really asked, they would say so. And they might say some things have been tested so deeply for so long that we're pretty darn confident that they work. But again, what they work doesn't mean this is an absolute description of reality. What it means is we can rely on this to do something. So Newtonian mechanics was partly invented to learn how to, catapult rocks at castles, because you have to find out how the arc of a projectile moves. If that wasn't really reliable, artillery wouldn't work. Those guys are constantly testing that to make sure it still is true, right? If at some point gravity starts working differently and all of those models stop working, a lot of people will notice, and they would drop it like a hot potato and be like, oh, things are different now. We have to figure this out, right? It's pragmatic, not existential. but for lots of us, I think it's helpful if we have the same approach. Something is worth holding on to if it works. Most of our conversations about things, some of them are about what works, and some are about what we believe in, and those things get really muddled. That's kind of what I'm talking about here. But if we can stay with the pragmatic, we are able to change our minds really as new information comes in. And I would hope that we retain that kind of flexibility. So now I want to make things more complicated. Because if we think about worldview, what are some of the really predominant worldviews that many of us in the global north, or in the industrialized west, or in the cultures descended from the European rational enlightenment and its colonies, what are some of our deep worldviews? Right? Many of us came from theistic religions and maybe still hold those, or those have become shaky. Deconstruction is a buzzword right now in evangelical Christian circles. People are questioning. I think it's great to question. But what are some of the deep worldviews? And I wanted to name just a few that are extremely pervasive right now in a kind of post-Christian, post-Judeo-Christian progressive culture that many folks in the convert Buddhist world are in. And the two that I focused on in the writing today were humanism and materialism. Humanism is really an outgrowth of the Enlightenment in Europe. It happened when God died. Nietzsche didn't kill God, but he reported the death. He noticed in culture that the cultural force called God no longer was having the impact that it used to have. And that's what he meant by God is dead. That the belief in that being as the fundamental view through which to understand the entirety of life in the cosmos, that was waning throughout the rational world. That continues to have an immense impact. And I think it has an immense impact in so many ways, even now, where, here in the United States, our two major parties, among the many fundamental views that they are split on, one is that one of the parties is far more devotedly Christian than the other one, and actually far more devotedly religious at all than the other one. And that's real, for folks to really lose an ancient worldview that was governing and shaping life, for millions of people for thousands of years. What could replace that? And one of the things that replaced that was humanism, really bringing the humans to the center of the cosmos instead of God and Jesus. And doing that has all of these ripple effects around how we understand who we are on the planet. In a certain way, it was a necessary worldview in order for something like the Industrial Revolution to take place. How could we despoil so much of, God's green earth without deciding that it no longer was God's green earth, but that it was just our place to be in and to use and to do things in? So, humanism places humans at the center of the cosmos and makes our narratives the most important story around, more important than the story of any of the other animals, the spirit beings, all of that. Going along with that, then, the scientific revolution, part of this same movement, turns into the deep worldview, and I'll call it a religion, of materialism. Scientific materialism meaning the view that only that which can be measured, perceived and measured in the physical world is actually real, has real meaningful identity, and that everything else, even things, it's like, okay, you can measure emotions, you can measure, biochemical changes in the brains when you're in love. Like, okay, so that's real, but things that are hard to measure, like God, or meaning, or spirit, or the soul, or heaven, but also things like justice or truth. What are they? They're cultural concepts, they're stories, they are flimsy ultimately. And so materialism begins to question all of these old guiding lights. And importantly for our conversation around the Dharma, one of the things that it questions is what happens after death. Virtually every culture on the planet has a story about what happens to human consciousness after death. It goes to the realm of the ancestors, or it's reborn in another body, or it is reborn once into a spirit body in either heaven or hell, or there's lots of variations of all this, right? Materialism can't measure that. A few folks are trying, but mostly it's hard to measure. If you want to look at the studies trying to measure it, you can read Bhikkhu Nalio's book on rebirth, where he looks at all of the collected accounts of both near-death experiences and children remembering their recent rebirths, and it's super fascinating, including a young kid in Sri Lanka who can chant in Pali at a very young age in a style that hasn't been chanted for 1,000 years. Interesting. The kid's now a grown-up monk. He's a good chanter. So he's minor reincarnation celebrity in Sri Lanka some decades ago. But materialism can't place these stories, and so then they get set aside as myth, as psychology. Probably if you've come across the Buddhist teaching on the 6 realms, that there are hell realms, ghost realms, animal, human, Titan, and God realms, you've probably heard them taught on, I've probably taught on them here, as a kind of imagistic psychology. When you're lost in anger, you're in a hell realm. When you're lost in grasping, you can be in a ghost realm. When you're lost in dullness and repetitiveness and hunger, you can be in an animal realm, etc. When you're lost in pleasure and bliss, you can be in a God realm, losing mindfulness. I think that's a helpful way to use those teachings, but that's also a materialistic interpretation, because nothing in the text says that they are necessarily a psychology. The texts are very clear about what their psychology is. There are lists of emotions, lists of mental states. These are different. They are realms. They are different. How do you reckon with that? You can't from within a materialistic framework. But the materialist framework does something deeper, which is that it denies rebirth. Rebirth is really complicated to wrap yourself around if you didn't grow up in a culture with a worldview that accepts rebirth. If you grew up in scientific materialism, as many of us did, or in something with rebirth but very different, like Christianity, one rebirth, and someone else decides. Rebirth is really challenging for so many folks. But without rebirth, without rebirth, there's not a way to explain how our actions impact our own well-being into the future. I could say, okay, that works within this lifetime. I can tell that if I do good in this lifetime, my mind states are better in this lifetime. I don't necessarily, escape suffering in this lifetime. Like, I could be terribly tormented, but maybe I have, more loving mind states, like Tibetan monks in the Chinese prison, sending loving kindness to their captors. But or some archetypal story of someone in a terrible situation who maintains a beautiful mind state. But karma has to be bigger than that, I think, to really function. The path to liberation is long and not easy to attain in a single lifetime. So if you've got a lot of trauma, or even a little bit, and you're not making progress toward really cleaning up your inner landscape, in a materialistic world, when death comes, it's just over anyway. And like, lots of us could tolerate suffering for a few decades. Lots of people do, right? Not having a worldview that can help them out with it, or having one that barely allows them to tolerate it, or makes it possible for them to tolerate it, but they don't seek liberation. You can bear it and die. And I think the natural result of this, is where Albert Camus, the French existentialist, reached, reflecting on the horrors of the 2 world wars, and coming from the existentialist philosophy that looked directly at existence without the comforting story of God and salvation, and said that the only meaningful decision a human makes is whether to commit suicide or not. Because in the absence of an afterlife, our actions don't mean that much. They mean something for other people, they affect the world, but they don't mean that much for us individually. And so why not just be a good person for a while and then retire into oblivion? But the Buddha categorically teaches that suicide is wrong. In fact, suicide is the reason for the first precept of not killing. It originally was about suicide, not about homicide. So the whole conception of the path as something that where our actions create the momentum for future well-being or future suffering, and that bit by bit over time we can purify that stream of action, or karma, in order to realize the end of suffering by uprooting grasping completely. That depends on a longer arc of practice than one life, for most people can hold. And the Buddha talked about it incessantly, constantly. It's the first thing he did on the night of his awakening, was look at his past lives, right? And look at how beings die and are reborn in accordance with their actions. The whole theory of karma depends on rebirth, which means it's incompatible with materialism. Materialism is the modern version of an ancient philosophy that the Buddha argued against. And the philosophers of the Buddha's time argued it specifically around karma. The argument was that our actions don't fundamentally matter. Whether you do good or ill, it may have a momentary effect, but in the long stream of life, it has no fundamental meaning. And that after we die, nothing happens. We just disappear. And the Buddha said that is categorically wrong view. That's just wrong. And then he gave practices to say, you don't have to just believe me on this. It's important to concentrate the mind enough to be able to see your own past lives and see for yourself, using the scientific method, that this is true. This is super difficult to do for most people's minds. And so we're left with this thing as a really difficult point of belief, right? As if I have to believe this. And it's hard to believe because the materialist proposal is so very convincing. The rational proposal is so deeply convincing. I think it's easier to get out of humanism than out of materialism. You can get out of humanism by actually observing animals and loving them. It's not that hard to realize that humans are not the most important species in the cosmos. But it's very difficult to back out of a view that says that anything else, anything that you can't observe in this material way simply isn't true. You have to fight upstream very hard in a culture that believes that, because you're just a nutcase if you are more animistic or more, spiritualistic than the normal view here. And so in the Buddha's day, this view that said that actions don't matter, that's called nihilism. That's what in the Buddhist text is called, because it comes down to a belief that nothing is meaningful. I think a lot of contemporary people are not what we would call nihilistic because they believe in goodness, they believe in hope, they believe in that our actions have an effect. But I think it's important to really wrestle with, like, if my idea is that my actions have an effect, even beyond my life, which clearly many people's do. Your family remembers you after you die. If you do something big in the world, it has ripples. Even small things in the world have ripples that go out past your life and influence others. But that's the only way that materialism can really hold that our lives have meaning, is that they have meaning for others. And so we have to maintain a kind of generosity attitude. I'm doing what I'm doing for others, right? And yes, as I do that, I have a better life in the here and now. Like, you can spiral it a few times around and get back to, and if you draw in some of the non-dual, you can land at like, don't worry about future lives, just do it for the here and now. Acting good creates good mind states in this lifetime, and it's good for others. There's no reason not to do that. The Buddha does give a version of Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager was, if you don't know whether God exists and there's judgment of your actions or not, it's better for you, just in case, to act ethically. Because just in case God exists and your actions are going to get judged, it's better to not be a schmuck. And you have better chances, just in case heaven is real, even though it's probably not. That was Pascal's wager. The Buddha says exactly the same thing. He says, okay, maybe you don't want to believe that your actions have an effect in the future for your own well-being later. But wouldn't it suck if you were wrong? Because hell is really bad. He says the same thing. And so, that's not that convincing for a lot of modern folks. That's not a completely rational argument. But that's the thing about this whole thing, is that none of the rational arguments can land with really with the project of full enlightenment. And I think that's why one of the symptoms we see in convert Buddhist circles is people not only not really wrestling with rebirth or not wanting to believe in rebirth, just not believing in rebirth, but also not really believing in liberation, not really believing in enlightenment, right? If you drop rebirth, you can also drop liberation. And if you drop liberation, then this is just a path that creates a good life in the here and now. And that's pretty good. Like, that's worth it. But the Buddha would say that's like taking the branches and never getting to the heartwood of the holy life. And so I think it behooves us to at least wrestle with the problem of what the Buddha is pointing to, and how it might trouble the waters of our own sense of ourself in the world and what our path is. All right. Pause there. Thank you.